On June the 2nd, just a month ago, the coronation took place. And today, Lili Kowalska, who came to England after her country was invaded in 1939, is going to talk about what the coronation meant to her as a naturalized Briton. Mrs. Kowalska.
I've lived 13 years in England, and for 4 of them I've been a British subject. Yet it is only since the coronation that I've really felt what is meant by being a loving and loyal subject of the Queen. Like many new Britons who came here in the war, I've spent most of my life in Republican countries, and before I came to England I couldn't see anything specially desirable in monarchy. I was inclined to think that kings had had their day, and that a republican system was a natural and logical step forward in political progress. But I know now that things aren't as simple as that. That way of thinking leaves out a lot of imponderables, just as the scientific approach we used to be so fond of leaves out a lot of imponderables too. You remember how at the end of the First Great War, when monarchies were falling like ninepins and science was enthroned in their place, wonderful nurseries were prepared where psychology and scientific methods ruled. Here the supermen of the brave new world were to be raised, away from the reactionary conditions of their parents' homes. But something went wrong. In spite of meticulous care and perfect surroundings, the children didn't always thrive. They seemed better and happier, in fact, when they returned to live under less favorable conditions with their own parents. Some indefinable personal quality was lacking in these scientific nurseries. And it seems that there must always be this longing in people, not for security alone, but for warmth and sympathy and protection, and that this longing needs a human symbol to center on. A cold abstract conception of a principle isn't enough. Those of us who lived under the shadow of European 20th century dictatorships, which were the neo-monarchies of our generation, know that that instinct is so strong that it can drive men to give their loyalty and their lives for a single human symbol, their leader. But we learn too to fear and distrust this instinct, because ambition, fanaticism, and cruelty have so often harnessed it to their evil work. It is only in these last few weeks that I've come to realize that this, like all the other instincts of mankind, was given us for our good and leads to evil only when men desire evil or do not wish enough to fight it. This is how I found out. When I first came here during the war and after it, I saw the close and friendly contact between the throne and the people, and I admired the royal family, their way of life, their discipline and simplicity. But I couldn't see that these things had any deep significance in the life of the nation. When King George VI died, we, the New Britons, felt the same deep grief as you did, even though it'd been our king for such a short time only. And I found myself wondering a little why this should be so. I thought it was because he was a man of such admirable courage and devotion to duty. I told myself it was natural to mourn such a man, even though he was personally unknown to me. But I mourned him as a man, and not as a king, or so I thought. The months passed, and the preparation for the coronation began to take shape. I like celebrations, and I began to look forward to this one. I was curious about it too, for I'd never lived through a coronation before. I had no idea what to expect. As the street decorations and window displays began to appear, every day bringing its new crop of surprises, I was glad and mildly astonished to find myself being drawn into the golden spiderweb of gaiety and joy which expectation and tension were spinning everywhere. looking back now, I think it was then, during these weeks, that I began to get a glimmering of understanding of what the crown really means. For I remembered festivals and parades in the different republics where I had lived, and they weren't like this. They seemed, in comparison, to be strangely inert and meaningless, mere spectacles and pageants. They were put on for the people. But here the festival gave people the sense that they were partaking in it, contributing to it. It was just that I found so exciting, so new. The feeling that everyone, whatever his origin, his job, his political views, was a living part of the great celebration that was going forward. During the weeks of mounting excitement, I began to recognize, slowly, gropingly, what it was that was driving me forward with such multitudes of others. It was a rising gale of emotion, carrying everyone in its path towards the same goal. And when I recognized this common thought and common feeling, I found a new and thrilling experience, the sense of oneness with the British crowds. I usually keep away from crowds. They give me claustrophobia. I suppose because most of the crowds I've known abroad have been either in a hysterical or an ugly mood. But these crowds were an eye-opener to me. They were so good-humored and balanced, so childlike in their expectancy and enjoyment, and so childlike, too, in their instinctive feeling of a vast family relationship. A relationship quite unlike the philosophy or racialism of other nations. I couldn't have known that the cold, reserved British would enjoy themselves in such an orderly, yet matey exhilaration. The barriers between the Britisher and the stranger in his midst only come down at times of great sorrow or joy. They came down during the war, and they came down, though I hadn't understood why, at the time of the King's death. Now, at last, I understood that it was only by accepting this sense of family loyalty and affection towards the Queen and the royal family that I could find a real sense of unity with my new fellow countrymen. At last I understood it, but still with my mind alone. I had to wait until coronation morning itself for this understanding to be translated into feeling. In the last few days before the coronation, I was struck by the great trouble which the Queen took, attending rehearsals, preparing herself to be perfect in word and movement during the ceremony. And I couldn't help comparing her actions with the behavior of the dictators of our age on ceremonial occasions. How they would have strutted on, unrehearsed, arrogantly capsizing the ancient ritual in the flood of their exhibitionism, their eloquence, and their power. She was content to mold her actions to fit the age-old pattern of the sacred rite, to be the willing servant of history and of the duty which history had imposed on her. So, as the Queen prepared herself for her crowning, I too was prepared by these thoughts for the startling glimpse of truth I was to receive. To be present at the Queen's hallowing through the television broadcast was a profoundly spiritual experience. It came as a shock to me, and, I believe, to a multitude of astonished people, not only those who were New Britons like me. We had expected dignity and splendor. We had been sure the chief actors would show reverence and sincerity, but we had not thought to find ourselves taking part in a timeless sacrament, a baptism into the mystery of a service, a marriage between the Queen and her people, and a communion of both with God. The absence of color in the little screen seemed to emphasize the spiritual meaning of the ceremony, for excess of splendor would have distracted one. The supreme moment came for me when the Queen laid aside her majesty with her robes and jewels, and sat, alone and unattended, in a plain white dress, waiting with bowed head for her anointing. I felt the deep sincerity, the loving reverence, and the true humility before God which radiated from her, and suddenly my heart was touched with glowing love. Here, I felt, is a true symbol, the living human symbol of the Christian society in which my soul longs to find its home. And in that simple, dedicated figure, I saw the assurance that this nation and Commonwealth are united not in the bonds of birth and history alone, but in their devotion to simple human virtues, which it is the privilege of the Crown to cherish and exemplify. So, as the Archbishop invested his anointed Queen with all the glorious panoply of majesty, I was able to add my own crown of love and loyalty as she was lifted up into her throne, Queen indeed over her people, of whom, by the mercy of God, I am one.